the two tribes that are really important are Judah, the tribe of Judah, which is where Jesus comes down through his lineage, and then this tribe of Joseph, because it splits off and becomes Manasseh and Ephraim. And so now we're going to move into Exodus. And Moses is the son of a Levite. I had missed this before too. His dad was a Levite priest, and his mother was also the tribe of Levite. So he's got strong Levite heritage in him, which is the priestly tribe. And Pharaoh, because of these Israelites becoming so powerful and numerous, they've become this great nation that God promised while they're in Egypt. And the Pharaoh kind of gets paranoid about that. And so he decides that to fix that, he tells all the midwives to kill all the the Israelite baby boys. And so Moses' mother has him, and she hid him for 3 months and eventually put him in a basket and placed him in the reeds by the Nile to try to save him in some way. And the Pharaoh's daughter finds him and raises him as her child. So it goes from, instead of this baby being destroyed, he ends up being raised in the palace. Moses grows up, and as an adult, he kills an Egyptian who was beating an Israelite, and that angered him, and he lashes out and kills this Egyptian. He realizes he's now a murderer, and he flees to Midian, which is current day Western Saudi Arabia, southern Jordan, southern Israel, and the Egyptian Sinai Peninsula. He marries the daughter of a Midian priest and has a son, and he becomes a shepherd. He's out there just being a shepherd now instead of being in the palace. So that takes us to Exodus 3, and Moses is out shepherding a flock of sheep, and they end up at Horeb, which is also Mount Sinai, and that becomes important later as well. So an angel of the Lord appears to him in a flame of fire in the midst of a burning bush that does not become consumed while it's burning, and God makes some promises to Moses in that instance. So he tells him that he's come to deliver the Israelites out of the land of Egypt. That's in verse 8 of chapter 3, and that's fulfilled in Exodus chapter 12, verse 37. And God will bring them up out of that land to a good and broad land, a land flowing with milk and honey, to the place of the Canaanites, which is current day parts of Israel, Palestine, Lebanon, Syria, and Jordan, and the Hittites, which is modern day Turkey, the Amorites, which is modern day Syria and Israel, the Perizzites and the Hivites, which is Palestine, and the Jebusites, which is Jerusalem. And that's all in verse 8. That has not been fulfilled yet. Israel has never had all the land that was really truly promised to them completely. There's always been some remnant of somebody in there that is against them. God promises that he'll be with Moses, and this will be evidenced by them worshiping on the same mountain, which is Mount Sinai, after they're out of Egypt. That is in verse 12, and that's fulfilled in Exodus 19. We're going to talk about that later. God will strike Egypt with all the wonders that he will do in it. That's from verse 20, and it's fulfilled in Exodus chapter 7 through 12. That's all the plagues that he does to try to get the Pharaoh convinced to release the Israelites to leave Egypt. And then when they leave Egypt, they give the Israelites, God will give the Israelites favor in the sight of the Egyptians. That's in verse 21. And that's fulfilled in Exodus 12, verses 35 and 36. And when they leave, they will not leave empty-handed, but will go with silver and gold jewelry and clothing. And he tells them to plunder the Egyptians. That's in verse 22. And that's fulfilled in Exodus 35 and 36. Moses was told that he was only going to bring them out of Egypt. He was not promised that he would go into the promised land. That was something I had overlooked for years. And this is fulfilled in Exodus chapter 12, verses 37 to 50, and Deuteronomy chapter 32, verses 48 to 52. So he does do what God told him he was going to do, which is bring them out of Egypt. But he was never promised he would go into the promised land, and he doesn't go into the promised land. That takes us up to Exodus 12. And before they leave Egypt, they have this Passover, the last plague that God brings upon Egypt, Pharaoh and the Egyptians, is that he's going to kill the firstborn of every family in Egypt. In order to be spared from that, the Israelites are told to do some specific things. They are to get a lamb or a goat without blemish that's 1 year old. And again, these point to Jesus and his crucifixion later. So Jesus was perfect. He had no blemish, imperfections. Number 2, they're to kill the lamb at twilight, which is between 3 p.m. and sunset. And Jesus died at 3 p.m. when he was crucified. So again, it points to him. Number 3, put blood on the 2 doorposts and the lintel. And that forms a cross across the top and down each side. And this points out that this means that the Israelites weren't automatically saved just because they were an Israelite. The angel of death wasn't going to pass over their house unless it had that blood. And again, that points to that blood was necessary to avert God's wrath. And the blood was applied with a hyssop, which is a small plant, and it's used for purification from sin. And you can read about that in Leviticus chapter 14, verses 4 to 6, and Leviticus chapter 49, verses 51 to 52. Numbers chapter 19, verses 6 to 18, Psalm 51, verse 77, and Hebrews chapter 9, verses 19. I know that's a lot of them, but you can replay that to catch them. But hyssop was also mentioned, I believe, at Jesus' crucifixion. Number 4, they had to roast that lamb or goat on a fire, and it had to be eaten that night. Anything that was left had to be burned. Number 5, they were to eat it with their belt fastened and sandals on and with their staff in their hand, and to eat it in haste. And they didn't mean to gobble their food quickly, but they were to eat that with an attitude of trembling expectation. Something was happening, something was going to happen, and they were to be ready to go at an instant, at a moment's notice. And number 6, the blood designates where the Israelites are, and the judgment will pass over them. So again, only houses that had this blood on them would the angel of death pass over, which is why they call it the Passover. Number 7, they're to eat unleavened bread for 7 days. And we'll talk about that later. That leavening in the Israelites came to recognize sin. So it's also, they did it this night because they were to be in a hurry, so they didn't have time for their bread to raise. So they were making this unleavened bread. And they were, number 8, have a holy assembly on the 1st day and the 7th day. So this is when they later practice Passover. They are to have this holy assembly on day 1 and day 7. No work shall be done on the 1st and the 7th day. It's like a Sabbath. No leavening in the house. And again, leavening represented sin when they celebrated this in future years. They were to stay in the house until morning. They were to keep this remembrance for generations. And this teaches the up and coming generations about their experience of being slaves in Egypt, and that God saved them. And they are to remember this forever and ever and ever. They were instructed to not break any of the lamb's bones, and that also refers to Christ's crucifixion, that none of his bones were broken. You can read about that in John chapter 19, verse 36, and Psalm 34, verse 20. And the last one is that non-Israelites could observe Passover, not this angel of death thing, but after that when they celebrated in other years, but they had to be circumcised, and that was an Israelite, that was a symbol of them being an Israelite and a follower of God, was that they were circumcised. This is observed in the first month, which then was called Aviv, A-V-I-V, of the first year. This now started a new religious calendar for them, and this Passover kicks that year off. So now we go to Exodus 14, and the focus of this chapter was they have started their journey, they've left Egypt, and now they've come to the Red Sea, and they've got, that Pharaoh's changed his mind. He's coming after them. They've got a Red Sea in front of them, and they're like, really, you brought us out here to kill us? And this was all predicted. God told him that he would harden Pharaoh's heart and he would pursue them. But God said that he would be glorified through this experience, and that was fulfilled in verses 21 to 31. And Egyptians will know that God is Lord. And again, this was fulfilled in verse 31. And Moses is told to stretch his hand out over the sea, and it'll be divided, and Israel will walk through on dry ground. And this was fulfilled in verses 21 to 29. We go to Exodus 16, and they're now on their journey. They've made it across the Red Sea. Their sea came back over all the Egyptians and killed them. And so now they started the next phase, which is their journey to the Promised Land. And the people begin to grumble because they're hungry. And God gets irritated with them, but agrees that he will rain bread from heaven on them. That's in verse 4. They're to gather a day's portion every day, verse 4. And this was a test whether they will walk in God's law or not. And that's in verse 4. This was fulfilled in verses 20 and 27. And you'll learn that they don't all obey. They were to gather twice as much on the sixth day. That's in verse, that's in verse 5. And fulfilled on verse 22. And again, that was so that they would not be working on the Sabbath. They would gather twice as much on the sixth day. They would eat that extra portion on the seventh day, which was the Sabbath. They weren't to gather any extra on days 1 through 5, but some of them did. And if they gathered more than what their day was supposed to be, it would rot and mold and bugs and all kinds of stuff. So that made them, the greedy ones were gathering more than they were supposed to, which they weren't supposed to do, and it turned buggy. And then they were to gather double portion on the sixth day, and people were like, well, wait a minute, isn't that going to rot? But God was like, no, that's what I want you to do. And so if they obeyed, they were fine. If they didn't, they ended up with buggy food, and they were disobedient. And that's what he meant by that. He was going to test whether they were going to walk in God's law or not. So they get through that of being hungry. Then you go to Exodus 17, and now they're grumbling because they're thirsty. These people cannot be happy. So Moses takes some of the elders. God tells him to take some of the elders, take his staff, go to Mount Horeb, or this Horeb, which is Mount Sinai, and to strike the rock, and water will come out of it. And so he does that. And so God promises that he'll give him water, and he does. But that also talks about the Amaleks attacking the Israelites. And this is their first time that they've had to do a battle. And they're successful. They win that battle. And God promises that he will utterly blot out the memory of Amalek from under heaven. And you can read more about the Amaleks in Chronicles 4, verses 43, 1 Samuel chapter 14, verse 48, chapter 15, verses 1 to 8, 32 and 33, 1 Samuel chapter 27, verses 8, 1 Samuel chapter 30, verses 1 to 20, and 2 Samuel chapter 8, verse 12. And again, I know that's a lot of them, but they all reference these Amaleks. And they were not blotted out completely in this instance, but Saul gives them a major blow years later, and King David really kind of wipes them out in a battle. And they were effectively erased from the world stage. They no longer are important or great warriors or of any importance after David battles them later. Now we move to Exodus 19, and this is where we have the Mosaic covenant, and the people are told don't approach Mount Sinai. This is the chapter that when I began at the beginning of the lesson, they said that he would know that he was with him because he would return to this mountain to worship. Well, this is that instance. This is the fulfillment of that promise. So the deal is on this Mosaic covenant is that they have to obey God's voice. That's in verse 5. Keep God's covenant, also in verse 5. He promises them Israel will be a God's treasured possession among all peoples. He's now elevating to them that they're going to be his one and only love here. And that's in verse 5. And Israel will be a kingdom of priests and a holy nation. That's in verse 6. And God will appear to Moses in a thick cloud so Israel can hear God speak and believe. That's in verse 9, and it's fulfilled in verses 16 and 18 in Exodus 20, verse 1. And it freaks the people out. They hear this voice, and they're like, oh, make it stop. Israel must consecrate, which means wash their garments, to get ready for this worshiping experience with God in verse 10. That's fulfilled in verse 14. They do go consecrate themselves and get washed, otherwise putting on their Sunday best. And the last one is the Israelites must not go up onto or touch the mountain until the trumpet sounds a long blast. And that's instructed in verse 12, and it's fulfilled in verse 17. That moves into Exodus chapter 20. This is where the 10 Commandments were given to the Israelites. To review those quickly: no other gods but God. Do not make carved images or likenesses. Do not bow down to these idols. Don't take the name of the Lord in vain. Remember the Sabbath day to keep it holy. That means to rest on the Sabbath. Honor your father and mother, that our days may be long in the land. That's important. That's the one commandment that comes with a kind of a condition. If you honor your father and mother, you're going to live a long time. Do not murder. Do not commit adultery. Do not steal. Do not bear false witness. Do not covet. And then he also concludes with a statement again about don't make gods of silver or gold. And if you make an altar, make it of earth or stones that are just rocks that are piled up. Don't cut them. Don't make them pretty. And that is interesting that God wants this altar to be of dirt or unhewn rocks. It's like the rougher the better. He doesn't want it to be elaborate and pretty. It's not about how it looks. It's about the purpose of it, which is to worship God. And so the altar will not have steps. It says in there you don't have steps so that the priests aren't going up these steps and you can see up their gown and expose themselves. So interesting. And then we move into Exodus chapter 23. And here they are given the angel of the Lord is going to lead them. And again, this is kind of a if-then or covenantal promise is if you obey the voice of the angel and do not rebel. That's in verse 21. And if you obey the angel, Israel's enemies will be an enemy of God. So if they obey the angel, whoever Israel's enemies are going to be God's enemies. And 3, as they move into the lands they are to conquer, do not bow down to their gods, nor serve them, nor do as they do. Utterly overthrow them and break their pillars into pieces. And this is in verse 23 and 24. And this is important because he doesn't want a remnant of these other cultures left there to influence them. And he says, don't make covenants with these enemies. These peoples are called enemies. And if you coexist, they will lead you to sin and they'll be a snare to you. He's trying to give them a heads up that says, wipe these people out. There's a reason for it. I want you to basically be pure and obey God's laws and don't be influenced to worship the idols of these other tribes or these groups, like these Hittites, the Perizzites, these groups that I mentioned earlier. And they don't obey that. I mean, we're going to read, as you read through Exodus, Leviticus, and all the other Old Testament books, you're going to see that this happens. They don't completely eradicate them. They end up marrying into these people, adopting their culture. They start worshiping to their idols. And he also says in these verses in chapter 23, if you obey, God will bless their food and water. They'll have no sickness, no miscarriages or barrenness. And as they move into these new areas, the people will be confused and terrified, and that hornets will drive the enemies out. So again, I found this interesting. I hadn't noticed that before. A lot of people have issues with God telling them to go in and wipe these people out and just to kill them. But this kind of hints that God's going to confuse them and terrify them, and that a lot of them are going to leave on their own accord. So they're not going to be slaughtered and murdered, but they're going to leave out of fear, and also that God will take them out in small bunches instead of just clearing out the whole acreage of the Hittites. Because he says if he does that, the animals and the vegetation will take over. And so if he has them move out in slower pieces, that the Israelites can slowly take over that land, then they've got this fertile land that's ready to grow crops and stuff on. And I found that interesting because I hadn't noticed that before when I've read the Bible through. So that is Exodus, and we finished in good time tonight because I didn't take time to read verses and verses. So we will start with lesson 4 next week, which is Leviticus. And on the Facebook page, I've given you the list of the chapters that you need to read. So we get to skip some of those. And then lesson 5 will be in the book of Numbers. And I'm still working through that, but we've got just a few chapters to read in Numbers. A lot of that is census, and it's stuff that you don't need to read. You're welcome to read it, but it doesn't relate to our Bible promises and prophecies. But there are some prophecies in there that we will touch on. So I will also post that of which chapters, but I'm up to chapter 24 so far, and all we're reading is Numbers chapter 14 and Numbers 24 so far. So only 2 chapters in Numbers. So hopefully we'll start moving through the books a little faster until we get up to the books of the prophets, and then we're going to get slowed down again. I have these lessons typed up. If you want any of those copies, contact me on Facebook or private message me or whatever, and I can send these to you. Don't want to give them to you if you're going to be bored with them, but if you want to have these to look at references or whatever, I'm happy to share those with you. Happy reading, and I'm enjoying these lessons and studying. I love the Old Testament. Hopefully you do too, and continue to look for, almost every book has something that points to Jesus. We've seen that in Genesis, we've seen that in Exodus, and hopefully we're going to see that, and I know we will, in Leviticus, because we get into the feasts and those kinds of things. So I will see you or talk to you again next week. Have a good evening. Bye.